Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Here's the Deal, virtual edition. So this episode, we have someone really wonderful with us. I'm really excited to get to know her and get to talk to her. We have the wonderful Dr. Kelsey Finn with us. Kelsey is a geneticist, a bioethicist, and an empathy enthusiast. She received her PhD in human genetics from Johns Hopkins, and she completed her postdoctoral training in bioethics at the Mayo Clinic. So Kelsey's sort of main focus is finding ways, figuring out when, how, and what to talk to children and young adults about when it comes to genetic diseases and health information. So I'm sure you guys are thinking, oh my goodness, this is a question that I've been wondering for a long time. How do I talk to my kids about HD? And this is why we have the lovely Dr. Finn with us. So welcome, Kelsey.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
So as a geneticist, tell me what kind of got you interested in communicating about genetic diseases? What kind of brought you into this fun HD world that we live in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was a graduate student, I did we were required to do 3 different laboratory rotations. And I did one of mine with Dr. Deborah Matthews, who works at the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins, and she was doing a really interesting study on the first cohort of individuals to be pre-symptomatically tested for HD back in the 80s and 90s. So her study was looking at the long-term effects on both individuals and their family members of pre-symptomatic testing for HD. So we were doing interviews with these people to try to figure out, how did it affect their decision to have children, their decision to get married, their decision to, pursue an education or travel or purchase different types of insurance. And one thing that we kept on hearing over and over again in the interviews was that one of the worst or hardest things about having HD was the question of whether, when, and how do I talk to my kids about this? Because as a parent, I don't want to burden my children with information or give them too much information that, they might not be able to handle or they might not be ready to handle. And I just want them to, let kids be kids and be worry-free. But on the other hand, we were hearing about instances where the family didn't talk about it and kids ended up finding out about HD much later. And that's really hard. And we saw, a lot of impacts on family relationships and so forth. And so that's what really got me interested in this question of family communication, right? So how do we tell people, what data can we give people about whether, when, and how to communicate with their kids about HD? And when we go and look in the academic literature, there's really not any information. And so, from a medical standpoint, then how on earth are we going to be able to counsel people and tell them, well, according to the data, this is what we recommend? So that's what really prompted my interest in this question and subsequently my research on this topic.
It's so interesting hearing about this because my background is social work. So my social worky perspective is thinking about, impacts on development, impacts of early intervention for children or young adults who are being impacted by major stressors, how the impacts of open family communication, family dynamics. So in my social worky brain, and we've been talking about this so much through youth events with the National Youth Alliance or our sort of global youth partners in HDO or HSC and YPAD, we say it's important to have open communication with your young people about HD. It's important because of, X, Y, or Z reasons, developmental reasons, because kids are just so much smarter than we think they are. And because having open communication means that there can build trust within the family. But it's nice to have this feeling of it's not just us, it's not just social workers, it's not, it's not just our spidey senses. There is real empirical data behind when, where, and how to have a discussion about Huntington's disease with your kids. So thinking about that, what were some of the things that you guys were noticing as you interviewed interviewed families about their communication styles and how they talked about HD with their kids?
Yeah, so let me first start by talking about sort of the negative effects that we were seeing. So in cases where families didn't communicate with their kids, and kids, were adults and maybe they were married and about to have a baby, and then mom and dad said, hey, by the way, we have HD in our family and here's what this means. Or in cases where kids didn't find out about it from their parents, maybe they found out about it from a cousin, or they overheard a phone conversation between mom and somebody else, or they saw an email. That tended to really erode the parent-child relationship, and kids were pretty upset when they found out. So kind of that in mind, some recommendations on how to best communicate with your kids, what we found from our research that worked really well. So you want to start early, and you want to try to normalize the information. So it's not, oh, you're married, you're about to have a baby, guess what? We have this thing called HD. It's, starting from a younger age, where you can just slowly introduce it and then have gradual conversations over time. So this isn't a one and done type deal, right? This is going to be small conversations frequently that kind of just happen over time as the child matures. And it's really hard because a lot of parents say, like, well, what age should I start? And there's not a magic number, which is really complex. So there's so many factors that go into the right time to tell your child, because each child is so unique and everyone matures differently and at different, speeds. So one 6-year-old might look entirely different from another 6-year-old in terms of emotional maturity. And so you really have to take into account your child's own maturity level. You have to take into account your family situation. So if it's the case that, you're around a family member that is affected by HD and your child can see they're moving a lot and they're acting differently, it's going to be important to address that earlier, versus if your family doesn't have anyone that your child is seeing who's, clearly affected by HD, then in that case, it can be okay to wait a little bit longer. So really taking into account your family situation, and then also contextually what's going on in your child's life. So if they're starting a new school or it's a really stressful time for them, maybe waiting 6 months and reevaluating, how things are going might be appropriate. So when I say gradual conversations over time, that can be kind of confusing, because does it mean like you're having the same conversation over and over again? And not necessarily. What it means is you kind of want the first conversation just to be really simple. So, grandma's moving a lot because she has something called Huntington's disease, and Huntington's disease makes people's bodies move more than other people's. And then you're just gonna kind of want to say, like, well, do you have any questions about that? And you're gonna let the child guide the conversation. And so they're gonna ask you the questions that they're ready to receive the answers for. So, it might be the case that the first couple conversations, the first couple years, there's no talking about the genetic component of HD, or you can say HD is caused by genes, and wait until, maybe your child makes the connection. Oh, since grandma has this and it's genetic, does that mean I could have it? And then at that point, that's the right time to talk about it. So really letting the kids guide the conversation.
The other thing I'm thinking about is, during some of these conversations, I think it's not uncommon for some kids to hear someone sick and then think, is this person, sick is bad, sick means dying, is this person dying? Mm-hmm. And with HD sort of is a complicated yes, but for a lot of folks, depending again on the developmental age of your child, you don't want to sort of say, yes, they are dying, but you want to kind of frame it in a different way, right? To try and mitigate some of the fear that's being, because that question is like, oh my God, do I need to be scared now? Right? That sort of is the real meaning of are they dying, is do I need to be scared? And to be able to say, right now they are okay. They are fine right now. Nothing is going to happen to them. today, nothing's going to happen to them tomorrow. You know, how it works is over a long period of time, we're going to see some changes, and they'll change and he'll get sick. But right now he's absolutely okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because that, I think, is also a question that a lot of parents are worried about. Oh my, how on earth do I answer this? Because maybe they're also wrestling with that reality themselves.
Right.
And the pain that reality brings with it. You know, when I think about parents who are really reluctant to talk about HD with their kids, I also think about parents who are really trying so hard to protect their kids from the realities of HD, right? And might be trying to do some repairing for what they might have experienced as young people. Mm-hmm. Whether it was, you know, they were exposed to a lot as young people, and maybe they didn't have open communication, but were exposed to a lot, and think that what they need to do is make sure that that young person or that child doesn't have that exposure. Mm-hmm. That keeps them safe. But a lot of times what we don't take into account is how smart kids are and how observant kids are. So how you talk about, like, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think you touched on two really important points. The first is that as a parent, not telling your kids, I think, I should have said this earlier in the show, but I think that comes out of the most loving and good intentions. And so I'm not, you know, criticizing any parent out there. I know that everyone's just trying to do their best, and it can just, you know, feel like you're doing the right thing when you're shielding them from this horrible thing. I think why this is important to talk about, though, is because what we're seeing is that actually not talking about it does have some negative consequences. Yeah. And so we really want to help families to have the healthiest, you know, relationship possible, because we are not islands. Humans are not islands, and we need that connection, and we need that support, and especially we need our family support when we're going through something as terrible as HD. So as a parent, I think it can be really overwhelming to try to figure out, you know, whether, when, and how to talk to your kids about HD, especially if this is a new thing for you, if this is a new diagnosis in your family or for yourself and you didn't know about it previously. One thing that we learned from our research is that it's really helpful is, if this is a new thing for you that you're just finding out, take some time to process it for yourself before you have that conversation with your kids. And the reason is, if you take that time to process it for yourself, ultimately when you do have that conversation with your children, you're going to be a lot calmer. You're going to be able to have some perspective, be more positive, you know, be more hopeful, versus when you're first finding out and you're so overwhelmed and you're so emotional. That conversation might be a lot scarier for your children when they see you crying and so upset. And, you know, so just taking some time for you as a parent. And the second point you touched on was how kids are so perceptive and way smarter than we give them credit for. So they observe little things that we think that they didn't, and they know that something's wrong. And as a kid, they tend to internalize that and think, oh gosh, I did something wrong, or it's my fault that mom or dad or grandma or grandpa is acting like this. They must be mad at me. I must have done something wrong. Or like you said earlier, they assume the worst. They think, you know, worst case scenario, oh my gosh, mom or dad is dying, grandma or grandpa is dying, this is horrible. So they'll kind of catastrophize to the worst case scenario when they don't know what's going on, because they sense something is going on and they don't know what it is. And that's just how kids kind of think. And so it's so important as adults and as, you know, parents, we actually give our kids comfort by telling them what's going on and talking to them about HD.
Yeah, I'm thinking also about the importance of like the depth of the conversation as well. I know you mentioned earlier sort of having, you know, knowing when and how, and judging by your child on what they're able to hear and letting them guide you. I think sometimes parents can be like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to tell them about HD, or I'm going to tell them I have HD, and then we'll be over. I'll have done it. Check. Great. It's done. But something that can then happen is if you say, well, you know, it's Huntington's disease. What is that? Well, it's a brain disease. And then you kind of cut off the conversation, or you don't have a more in-depth conversation. You know, every kid's going to go onto one of these and Google Huntington's disease, and it's going to be pretty overwhelming what they end up finding. And they're going to end up processing that information alone and on their own. And again, creating this sort of rift within the family where, you know, mom told me X, but didn't tell me A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And I had to find that out on my own. And now I have to process that on my own. And the message I'm getting is that we're not supposed to talk about this. We're not supposed to have more in-depth conversations about this. So I won't bring this to my mom, or I won't bring this to my other family members. You know, you mentioned some of those like negative impacts of not having open conversation. What are some of the negative impacts that you guys observed in your studies?
Well, I think probably the first and foremost is that erosion of the parent-child relationship and that trust between parent and child. And also, you know, when kids sense something is going on and they know something is wrong, but they're not talked to about it, or parents aren't talking with them about it, there can be a lot of like alcoholism, drug use, substance abuse, you know, eating disorders, anxiety, depression, all these things that kind of result as a result of this internal buildup of stress and anxiety and fear, kind of channel themselves in that way. And so instead of forming this channel of destructive coping mechanisms, we want to really form a healthy channel to cope with those emotions. And that healthy channel is communicating about it and being able to, like you said before, this isn't Huntington's disease, is a brain disease, and then we're done. Or I have Huntington's disease, and then you explain it, and then you never talk about it again. We want to have an open line of communication. And sometimes it's hard for kids to bring this up because they're not okay. They're not sure if it's okay to talk about this or not. And so that's why, as a parent, it's really important to check in with your kids periodically. Say, so I know we talked about Huntington's disease a while ago. What questions do you have since then? I'm sure there's things that you're wondering. What things might you be wondering? Or, you know, as they're getting older, just keep on checking in, or saying, you know, did you notice that grandma was doing this today? That's because of her Huntington's disease, and that's one of the symptoms. And what questions do you have about that? I'm telling you a lot of information right now, and I know there must be things you're wondering. So I also like the question, what questions do you have, instead of, do you have any questions? Because you might get a no. Most of the time, actually, you might get a no. So asking more, what questions can be effective?
Yes, so open-ended question versus closed question, right?
Yes, absolutely.
You know, if you're giving kids an out to be like, no, you know, but instead give them an opening to say, you know, oh, here are the questions that I have, because it's sort of going off the premise that there are questions.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing is what we saw in our research is that, you know, parents thought, oh, I haven't talked to my kid about the genetic component, and I haven't talked to my kid about this, so they don't know. And then when we talk to kids separately, they're like, yeah, I know this and this about HD because I Googled it, or I found out in school because we learned about Huntington's disease in biology, and I asked my teacher about it. And I don't know why my mom didn't tell me about it, because I already know all these things, but she thinks I don't know. So it's really this discrepancy in how much information parents want to give their kids and how much information kids want to receive from their parents. And we could see over and over again that kids want more information than what their parents are giving them.
Yeah, and I imagine going back to the issue of sort of eroded trust, it feels very different for young people when they hear that kind of information from Google, from a teacher, because you're doing a genetics unit in biology, or from, you know, somewhere else, from watching a documentary, as opposed to hearing it from your parent. That's a very different experience.
Because I mean, on Google, you're seeing, you know, there's no cure. It's 100% fatal. You have a 50% chance of having it, versus, you know, when you sit down with a parent, you can really talk about, there's a 50% chance that you have this and a 50% chance that you don't have this. And you can talk about some of the scientific research that's going on, and you can talk about positive things about it too. And, not that there's any positive things about Huntington's disease, but before you were saying, this diagnosis isn't an immediate death sentence. And I think talking about that is really important. So saying just because you're diagnosed doesn't mean you're going to die immediately. This is something where you can have this for several years and still be alive, and you might not get it till later in life, and all these things that a quick Google search is not going to inform someone of.
The other thing is, like, if it's a parent who's been pre-symptomatically tested, just having a gene test doesn't mean having symptoms. Like, that's another big piece as well. It might be that, dad got his genetic test back and he tested positive for the HD gene, and right now he's not showing any symptoms. So there's also kind of differentiating between the gene tests and being symptomatic and starting to show symptoms of HD. The other thing I mentioned that I think is also really important is that continual communication as symptoms change and progress, right? So that kids can also develop an understanding of what's going on, why behaviors might be happening, why behaviors might be changing, and learn to start to process those and try and attribute them not to their parent, not because their parent willfully, wants to be perseverating or wants to be, having extreme mood swings, but making sure that there's some knowledge that this is what the disease is. Because I think that could be also hard from a relationship between a child and a symptomatic parent, is if they also don't know what's going on, or they don't know that something that's happening in the home is because of HD progression, they're also going to attribute that to just their parent, them being them, and maybe having, dad or mom is acting this way and it's willful, or it's because they're a jerk, or it's because, whatever other reason, and not because their brain is literally changing.
Exactly. Or because, they did something wrong, or because mom and dad don't love them. And I think you bring up a really important point of almost teaching kids that the Huntington's disease is a separate identity from the parent. So it's not that, mom is really angry at you. It's that Huntington's disease affects mom's brain, and that can make her really angry sometimes, but it's not mom's fault. It's just the Huntington's disease makes her become really angry sometimes. So yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, and and still being able to sort of affirm how they are feeling, right? Affirm, like, it's mom doesn't hate you, and I know that it hurts when she says these things. She doesn't really feel that way. It's the HD that's changing her brain, right? This is the HD, it's not her. So that, I think, is a really important point too. Thinking about, I'm imagining if I'm a parent watching this, and I've been in that mode of protection. I've been thinking, I've got teenagers, my parent is, maybe their grandma's symptomatic, we don't see them that often, and I just found out that, and I've known for a while that I carry the gene, but I haven't told my kids, and they don't know. What are some of the implications for starting that conversation? Where can that begin?
Yeah, so if you're nervous that your kids will be upset that you didn't tell them earlier, I think what parents sometimes overlook is the power of an apology and the power of being vulnerable. So just saying, honey, I need to tell you something. There's this thing in our family called HD, and I haven't told you about this because it's a really scary thing, and I wasn't sure how to talk about it. And maybe I should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry if I should have told you sooner, but what I want to do right now is talk to you about it, and I hope that you can forgive me, and I hope that we can talk about it together. So, just acknowledging that maybe I should have talked to you about this sooner, and I'm sorry. So, and just explaining why you didn't tell them. So I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you with this information, or I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to have to worry about this. I don't think any parent has bad intentions for not telling their child. So I think just as a parent, checking in with yourself and asking, why haven't I told my child this? and then just telling them, why. And you can say, nobody's perfect, and I made a mistake here. I hope you can forgive me. But just kind of like owning that and explaining, I think most kids will understand, and they won't be upset they might be upset about everything you tell them, but I think ultimately it'll be better for the relationship, instead of them finding out later on, or from a source other than you, or by accident, or
and you said one of my favorite words, which is vulnerability. Vulnerability, I think, has huge reparative powers. Where breaks might have formed in a relationship because of a lack of communication, because of a perceived secrecy or real secrecy, vulnerability has a reparative power. If you're able to have those and do it from an I standpoint, I felt, I thought, I was scared, right? Talk about it from that, that gives that conversation such a different tone and such a different opportunity for the sort of repairing of those relationships.
Yeah, and you certainly don't want to take the tone of like, well, you had a lot going on, so you weren't ready for this. But like you said, just saying, I didn't know if I was ready to talk about it because I was really scared. So I think, what you said was awesome.
Yeah. And sometimes, thinking as a parent, sometimes behaviors that we see in kids can be a clue for us that there's a conversation that needs to happen, right? If you notice that you have a child who's acting out, if you have a child who's extremely anxious, if you have a child who is starting to engage in some of the maladaptive behaviors that you had mentioned, Kelsey, like that can be a clue, like, okay, we need to talk about something. There's something that we need to hash out, because they're externalizing all, like a cry for help. They're externalizing all of this stuff, saying like, I can't handle some of these thoughts that are happening in my brain. I can't handle some of this uncertainty that's occurring. And sometimes how they externalize it is in a way that can make them out to be the bad guy, right? Because that can sometimes be just the easier way for them to do it, whether it's, difficult behaviors, acting out, just being a sort of a hard kid to be around. But that's sort of them saying, I'm struggling with something. I'm really, really struggling. And I need to talk to you about something.
Yeah, exactly. I think in teenagers, that's code for I'm hurting.
Yes. Yeah. If there was like Google Translate, that would be.
Yeah, totally.
So the other thing I think that parents might worry about is trying to have this conversation alone. Who are some people that parents can reach out to, can work with, to try and have these conversations with their kids if they're really, really nervous, if they feel like I know I need to have this talk, but I don't know if I'm quite ready to do it by myself.
So I would recommend seeing if you can meet with a genetic counselor. Genetic counselors are great because they have tons of experience communicating with adults and kids with information like this. And for parents, I've heard a lot of genetic counselors will actually role play. So they'll say like, okay, let's practice telling your child, I'm gonna pretend to be the child and you practice telling me about HD. And they'll kind of, play devil's advocate and ask some hard questions. And it can actually, it sounds silly, I know, but it can actually build up your confidence a lot as a parent if you're not sure what to say, or you're not sure how to explain it, or genetic counselors have seen a lot of reactions from people, so they can kind of prepare you and maybe give you some information. I also think HDSA is a great resource. I've heard from so many people that either the materials on the site or somebody from HDSA has been just an amazing point of support, and has even participated in those conversations with parents and kids, which is awesome. And I think parents should know that you don't have to do this alone. There's so many people out there that want to help you and support you. And I think, our job, the medical field and HDSA, is just, we really want to empower parents to be able to talk with their kids about it, and then empower kids to have that open line of communication and ask questions and have that healthy channel for all those emotions that they're feeling.
Yeah, I think those are all such good resources, right? If you've got a genetic counselor that you've been working with that you trust, reaching out to them, maybe from your center of excellence where you got tested, reaching out to your chapter social worker or your center of excellence social worker, if you work with them and you really like them, they're an excellent resource. And yeah, we also have a youth social work program at HDSA through the National Youth Alliance. You can find information about that at the NYA's website, hdsa.org/NYA. And they're also there to help you figure out the conversation as a parent, and also to be there as a resource for the kid, for the young person. Say, like, if there are things you want to talk about and you don't feel like you want to sort of talk about them with your parent, we can talk about them separately. So they have somewhere that they can go and talk, or ask questions that they might feel like, I don't know if I can quite ask my parent this yet, but I want to ask someone. They're a great resource. So thinking about sort of future work that you guys are doing, what are the other things that you guys are looking at from a research perspective about communicating with young people about genetic-based information or genetic diseases?
Yeah, so going forward, I'm actually working on a grant right now that incorporates cognitive analysis of children's readiness to receive certain information and their ability to process it and make decisions about it, and kind of internalize that information to start thinking about how that might affect their life choices. And so the purpose of taking this child psychology perspective into account and using that in the research that we're already doing is really just to get a sense of scientifically what's going on inside of a child's brain, and to learn more about at which developmental stages it might be appropriate to give certain information. Because right now we're kind of just giving some really general advice, which is helpful to a lot of people, but I think going forward we need more work, more research to really understand more about how a child's brain develops and matures and what cognitively they can handle information-wise. We're also doing a survey to parents about their experience communicating with their kids, how they felt about it, what resources would have been helpful. And the goal of that survey is to hopefully help develop some of those resources so we can get those out to families in hopes that will make the whole process easier. So we're asking, what would be helpful? Children's books for, or resources for preteens and teenagers, resources for late teenagers, resources for parents on, how to approach this and navigate this, resources for doctors and genetic counselors who you might see that unfortunately just don't have a lot of information on this family communication piece, because that's something that unfortunately is a reality in the field right now. Is a lot of neurologists, they aren't aware of, or don't address specifically best practices in communicating with this about HD with children and other family members. So I mean, it's so complicated because right now this research that I've published and other people have published too exists in the academic literature. But that's not accessible to most families with HD. And so my hope is really to bridge that gap and make this information that we're learning from all these families with HD that's so rich and so helpful. At least that's what people tell me.
Yeah, I can't imagine that it isn't, because if I were a parent and I was looking at trying to find resources and all I found was academic literature, I'd be like, nope, this is not helping me at all. And speaking of which, I believe there's a book that's available.
Yeah, so I've actually written a children's book. It's called Grandma Has Huntington's Disease and It's Okay. caveat there, the title is supposed to be provocative. It's not meant to suggest that Huntington's disease is okay, but it's meant for a younger audience, and it's meant to be used as a launching pad for conversations to happen gradually over time, and kind of walks you through some of the symptoms of HD. And it's meant to be read and reread. And I think as you read it with your child, they'll kind of develop more questions as they get older and more mature. And so there's nothing in there that's going to be inappropriate for a younger child, but there's some things younger children aren't going to quite understand until they get older. There's also a section in the back for parents. It's tips for communicating with kids about HD. So kind of walks through a bunch of findings from our research, but in a really quick and easy to read way. So if I was a parent and I was trying to figure out how to talk to my child about HD, I wouldn't want to sit and read the manuscripts and the academic literature. I probably would not have time to do that, and they would probably be incredibly boring to me. So this is just meant to be like quick bullet points that are hopefully helpful. And like I said, just try to open the line of communication. It also explains what Huntington's disease is in a kid-friendly, age-appropriate way. And so if you're kind of struggling how to approach that, I think it can be helpful for kids to see pictures and just, go through the story of the book. So.
Yeah, I imagine sort of going through CAG repeats with a young child is not going to be super helpful.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Kelsey, for chatting with me, for engaging with the community, for doing this research, for helping social workers like me be able to back up our instincts with data, which is always very helpful. It is a huge help to the community. And again, talking with your kids about HD, it is not a singular process. It's not always going to be easy, but it is so worth it for the health of the relationships in your family, and for that young person in your family to feel like, great, I feel secure here. I feel secure in my ability to talk to my parents. I feel secure that if I have questions, they're going to get answered, or at least listened to, which is so important. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and thanks for all the families that have contributed to my research. There's so many out there, and I'm so grateful. And thanks to you, Jen, for the great work that you're doing and for having me today. It was great talking to you.
It was wonderful talking to you. And that's the deal with talking to your kids about HD.